So I'm going to tell you two stories about power. The first one takes place in 1628. A Dutch trading ship called the Batavia set sail with spices, silver, and around 300 people who had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to them. The ship hits a reef off the coast of Australia and falls apart. So the captain takes the best remaining boat, announces he's going for help, and leaves everyone else on a flat waterless sandbar in the middle of nowhere with no food or shelter and no functioning authority. Into that gap steps a man named Geronimus Cornelis. He is the ship's merchant, not a soldier nor a captain, not anyone with any particular reason to be in charge of anything. But here is the thing about this guy. He had wanted to be in charge of something for a very long time. And now, finally, incredibly, there was an opening. So with his leadership spirit, he divides the survivors into factions, builds loyalty by threatening, draws up a list of people he wants dead. Well, that escalated quickly. He doesn't do the killing himself, obviously, he's not an animal, he just gives the orders. By the time the captain comes back with help, over 100 people were killed, Cornelis is arrested, has his hands cut off, and is hanged, which honestly is pretty fair. Now here is a completely different story on a different island. In 1965, 6 Tongans teenagers, aged between 15 and 17, steal a fishing boat and sail directly into a storm. The boat gets wrecked, and they wash up on a tiny remote island called Ata, with basically nothing. They survive for 15 months by building shelters, growing food, keeping the fire going the entire time, and looking after each other when someone gets hurt. All 6 were alive and rescued, and the whole thing was fine. So you've got 2 groups of people, both stranded on islands with no government, police, rules, or a plan. One becomes a functioning little society, while the other becomes a tyranny. Similar situation, but completely different outcome. The easy answer, the answer that lives on motivational posters and coffee mugs everywhere, is power corrupts. Lord Acton said it in 1887. Everyone's been nodding at it ever since without really thinking about what it means. But Brian Klaas thinks that answer arrives way too late to be useful. This guy is a political scientist who spent 10 years interviewing dictators, cult leaders, and presidents, and has noted that those categories have more overlap than you'd hope. Because the problem isn't just what power does to people once they have it, but it starts much earlier with those who wanted it. And the reason your politicians keep letting you down, the reason they all show up with big ideas and somehow end up looking like everyone they replaced, isn't really about the individuals, but more about a system that was never seriously built to stop this from happening. There are 4 reasons this keeps going wrong. They all make each other worse, and by the end of this, the answer is going to be both more depressing and more interesting than power corrupts. Here is a fun thing about power. The people who want it most are usually the people who should have it least. This is not a hot take. It's almost just a math problem. And to see why, think about what running for office actually requires of a normal human being. You spend years calling strangers and asking them for money. You attend events where you eat rubber chicken and pretend to enjoy it. You say a lot of very careful nothing for hours at a time, and people call it leadership. You give up any resemblance of a private life, absorb an unlimited amount of public humiliation, and then actively go looking for more of it. Now ask yourself, what kind of person genuinely enjoys this? And that's not a rhetorical question. Think about it. The normal, well-adjusted person, the one that actually wants to help, looks at this and quietly returns to their garden, which is the normal and sane response. And also, for the rest of us, a problem. Because the people who stay, the sociopaths who enjoy all of this, those people are telling you something about themselves. Not on purpose, but they are doing it. Klaas calls this the selection effect. And the clearest example he uses isn't politicians, it's police. There is a small town in Georgia called Doraville, with about 12,000 people, and a completely average crime rate. Nothing especially threatening happening there. And yet, the police department owned a military armored vehicle, the kind that's normally deployed in active war zones. And it's the centerpiece in the recruitment video. And you might think, okay, weird flex, but whatever. But Klaas' point isn't about the vehicle, it's about the signal it gives. When your job listing is essentially a military hype video, you are not just advertising a position, you are calling out to a specific type of person. Someone who saw that video and thought, yeah, that. I want that fucking power. So that person applies. Compare that to a New Zealand police campaign that dropped all the weapons visuals and just talked about helping people. It attracted more women, more minorities, a much broader pool of people who wanted the job for completely different reasons. It's the same job, but completely different people applying. And this is the bit that matters. It's not just about who gets hired. It's more about who shows up at all. You can have the most strict hiring process ever designed, but if everyone walking through the door already has a specific relationship with power and control, the best outcome available to you is picking the least weird one. Now scale that up to politics. Research on people who actively seek power finds consistently higher rates of narcissism, lower empathy, and a greater comfort with bending the rules when it's convenient. Not in every case, obviously, but as a pattern, it holds. The appetite for the job comes packaged with exactly the traits that make someone bad at it, and the election hasn't even took place yet. But let's say you fixed it somehow. You build a perfect system that only attracted genuinely good, humble, normal people. They run and they win. And they show up on day one with the best intentions anyone has ever had. Power would still do something to them. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. We talked about it, so let's actually think about it. The most famous evidence for this is the Stanford prison experiment that took place in 1971. A psychologist puts students in a fake prison, assigns some of them as guards and some as prisoners. And within days, the guards are psychologically abusing people. The study gets written up, it goes into every introductory psychology textbook, and the conclusion seems simple. Give ordinary people power over other people and they become cruel. It's human nature, and there is nothing to be done. Now here is the problem. It later came out that the guards were coached, actually told in advance how to behave, by the researcher running the experiment. The whole thing was, to a significant degree, staged. So the most famous study ever conducted on the corruption effects of power was itself a pretty good example of someone abusing their power to get the results they wanted. Because there is a much larger body of cleaner research showing that power genuinely does change how people behave. People with more power are significantly more likely to lie, cheat, break social norms, and treat other people as basically irrelevant. Not everyone, and not always, of course, but the pattern keeps showing up across different studies, cultures, and contexts. The Stanford experiment was meh, but the thing it was trying to demonstrate is real. Power doesn't just flip a switch in someone. Like now you are a really good guy and tomorrow you become corrupted. Instead, power removes the things that were keeping certain tendencies in check. The person who was always a little too comfortable cutting corners finds that nobody's watching the corners anymore. The person who never had much patience for the people's problems finds there are fewer consequences for that now. So after all that, we end up with people who had an above average appetite for control and a below average concern for rules. And now you've put them in an environment specifically designed to make both of those things worse. And then there is another thing which Klaas calls the dirty hands problem. People in charge constantly face decisions where every available option causes harm to someone. And that's not even corruption. It's just a normal Tuesday in government. Difficult trade-offs, bad choices, and situations where being right and being good aren't the same thing. Over time, these kind of decisions accumulate. Compromise by compromise, the person making them is being quietly reshaped by them, just slowly remodeled by years of doing whatever the job required. From the outside, it's hard to tell the difference between someone who is genuinely corrupt and someone who is just reshaped by the job. Look, if this is the kind of thing you usually think about, this channel is for you. So if you are finding this useful, hit the like button and subscribe. It generally helps more than you think. And if you want to give me your opinion about all of this, or maybe you just want to say hi, the comments are right there. Okay, so now back to it. And now here is the part where it becomes also your fault. Not entirely, but enough to make you feel bad. Because so far this whole thing has been about the system and the candidates, and you've just been standing there watching it happen, an innocent bystander. Unfortunately, that's not quite right. Researchers at Princeton showed people photographs of two political candidates. Just the photos, nothing else. No names, political party, or policies. And asked the people to guess who won the election. They got it right about 70% of the time. 70%. just from a photo. What's happening is that somewhere deep in your brain, underneath all that rational policy evaluation you tell yourself you're doing, there is a very old, very simple piece of software running a completely different assessment. It's looking for a specific kind of face, strong, dominant, looks like they've handled the situation before. And when it finds one, it sends up a signal that just says, yep, this is the right leader. This software was written about 200,000 years ago, when picking this kind of person in your group was actually a pretty reasonable survival strategy. But it has not been updated since. It is now being used to select people who will run countries and manage international trade negotiations. And it's doing its best. But unfortunately, we have narcissists between us. Actual narcissists, not just your coworker who talks too much. They are more confident, more decisive, better at projecting the feeling that everything is under control. So the interviewers love them. But they also tend to produce worse outcomes once they actually have the job. But the interview is what selects them. And politics is essentially one very long public interview where the performance is the only thing that matters. So the traits that help you win the job work against you once you have it. This is quite upside down. None of this means you're stupid. It means you're human. And that's how our brain works. Klaas' fourth point hints to the idea that the people behave better when they think someone is watching them. Not dramatically better because they don't suddenly become generous and wonderful, but measurably better. Now think about who, in most organizations, actually gets watched. It's not the CEO, and neither is the board. Not the senior politicians making decisions that affect millions of people. It's the entry-level staff, the people at the bottom whose worst possible day at work causes the least possible damage. They get all the supervision, the monitoring software, performance reviews, random check-ins, while the people at the top, where a single bad decision can generally be catastrophic, mostly operate on the honor system. Klaas' conclusion about this is pretty blunt. We have the whole thing backwards. We are watching the wrong people. And it's exactly what you'd expect from a system that was designed largely by people who held power and were not particularly enthusiastic about being scrutinized. The accountability rules were mostly written by them. Funny how that went. Which means the corruption problem is also an environment problem, because the environment shapes the behavior. Change the environment and you change what people do. This is not a controversial idea, but it's just never seriously applied to the right people. And there is one more thing worth naming. Bad systems don't just produce bad outcomes. They push good people out. They get filtered out more and more. So the good guy who somehow makes it through all of that, survives all we've talked about so far, arrives at power inside an institution that wasn't built for what they wanted to do, surrounded by people who need it to stay exactly as it is. Which brings us back to the two islands we talked about in the beginning. The Batavia ship had a hierarchy before the ship sank. Ranks, titles, a chain of command. When the structure collapsed, Cornelis didn't build power from nothing. He stepped into existing machinery and pointed it at people. The conditions made him possible. Those 6 teenagers had none of that. No ranks, no inherited structure to weaponize. They built something flat from scratch. And it held. Same situation, but the power architecture was different. And the one we have, it's harder than ever to change. It's just that the people who have the power to change it have no reason to do it.